potential. See, God's not interested in taking you out, but actually bringing you in to the family of God. And so here he is. David's like, no, you don't understand. I made a commitment, by the way, to his father, Jonathan, and that's going to come into this in a little bit here. But he makes his commitment to his father, Jonathan. He's like, you don't understand, Ziba. I need to find this guy. And so he's chasing him down, and he finally finds Mephibosheth in 2 Samuel 9:8, and I love Mephibosheth's kind of response here. He says, Mephibosheth bowed down and said, "What is your servant? Who am I?" In other words, it's sort of the gravity, the weight of the grace and the kindness and the hesed that's being shown to him just starts to kind of hit him. It becomes real for him, and he feels absolutely unqualified, absolutely not worthy for this. And by the way, it's kind of interesting too, because what's interesting in the text is that David actually doesn't correct him on this. You kind of think, he goes on to say, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? Now you would think that would be the perfect spot for David to kind of step in, oh, you're not really that bad. You haven't really messed up that bad. It's not. You got a great smile. You got potential. I see there's some promise. There's some good things in your life. He doesn't do that at all. Because here's what David is trying to, I think, express to Mephibosheth, and I think express to us when it comes to the gospel, which leads to the third thing, is that your performance does not deliver you. Your performance does not deliver you. Your pain doesn't define you. Your past doesn't disqualify you. And get this, your performance cannot and does not deliver you. You can't act right enough. You can't modify your behavior enough. You can't try to turn your leaf over enough times. When your feet are broken, they're broken. But the good news is it's not about you. See, David's kindness that he showed to Mephibosheth was all about this commitment, this covenant, this promise he had made with Mephibosheth's father, Jonathan. And it's the same with you and I. The reason he invites us to be a part of the family, the reason we can celebrate, the reason we can walk in grace and walk in freedom and walk in victory is not because of the things we do or we don't do, but because of what Jesus did for us on the cross, because of the covenant made between God the Father and God the Son. And this is important for you to get, because I think a lot of us, we can almost kind of tend to take this distorted view that behind the gospel of seeing this God in the sky who needs us somehow. God is like he's up there cross-stitching and knitting and man, I could really use a friend right now. Like the whole purpose of the gospel is that God was just lonely and really needed a friend. But here's what you got to understand, is that do you realize that God doesn't need you? He doesn't. He doesn't need me. In fact, there's nothing, even at your best, there's nothing that you can do that's going to somehow add value to God. He's all sufficient. He's all powerful. He's got everything he needs. He doesn't need me. If I stop preaching tomorrow, don't you think you could find someone else to come and preach? Don't you think he could find someone else to testify? We come in this place, sometimes we think, oh, God just really needs my worship. Hey, look, even if we didn't worship, even if we're not on our A game in worship, the Bible says, listen, even if we never utter a worshipful thing to him, he said that the rocks will cry out. And if we don't share about who he is, listen, the Bible has stories of him using animals, using donkeys. I've shared this before. He could use a squirrel. Imagine sitting at Starbucks, squirrel's like, man, I collect all these nuts, but it's just, no matter how many nuts I collect, I feel like there's this emptiness in my soul. Do you know Jesus? He could use anything or anybody besides me. He doesn't need us. This is why this is good news, though. Because if God doesn't need us, that means he simply just wants us. That's the heart of the gospel, is this God who doesn't need you, he wants you. His love is not based on our performance. His love is based on his sheer generosity. And this is a problem, I think, for so many of us in our culture these days, is most of our relationships aren't always based on want, they're based on need. Or they need me at that job. Or they need me as a door greeter, because no one else could greet quite like I can greet. They need me for this. It's why a lot of marriages fall apart. It's because they go into the relationship trying to meet a need in their heart, a need in their soul. And the moment that their spouse isn't quite meeting that need, they go looking for somebody else to try to fill that need. But a real relationship, a lasting relationship, a godly relationship is based on want, not need. It's based on a God that wants you. He doesn't need you. I think of my wife, hey, look, the truth is at the end of the day, it is great, whenever she cooks dinner or does all these great little things and stuff, but at the end of the day, I can always find someone else to cook dinner. I can always find someone else to, do chores or things like that or whatever, around that. But I married her not because I needed something from her. I married her because I wanted her. I wanted her, and she wanted me. There was a want there. See, a lasting relationship, a true relationship, is based on wants, not need. And this is so important for us. In fact, do you get this? This is actually what separates the gospel, separates Christianity from every other religion out there. Because every other religion is the opposite. It's about a need from you as opposed to a want. Every other religion is we need you to pray so many times. I need you to be in church so many times. I need you to do this so many times. Need you to knock on so many doors. Only the gospel is about a God who says, no, I just want you. I want you. I don't need you. I don't need anything from you. I just want you. It's about a God who wants us, doesn't need us. In fact, this might even blow your mind, is that the gospel, get this, reminds us that when it comes to God's want for you, even when you don't do what he wants, do you realize that to him you're still the one that he wants? Even when you blow it, even when you mess up, even when you screw up a few times or a lot of times, even when you don't do what he wants, he still wants you. That's the amazing reality of this gospel message. And yet, here's my fear in sharing all this is that we would hear this and we hear, yeah, it's about grace. God's grace has no limits. His grace is sufficient for my life. Here's my fear, is that we would hear the good news, and yet, if we're not careful, we would allow it to become old news to us. We'd allow the good news to become old news to us. See, I think for a lot of us, we get the idea of saving grace. The grace that got us to the starting line when it came to this walk, came to this journey, this relationship with God. But I think many of us, we lose sight of another kind of grace, and that's sustaining grace. Sustaining grace. In other words, we think grace gets us to the starting line when it comes to our relationship with Jesus. But after it gets us to that relationship with Jesus, after we punch our card to heaven and we get eternal life, well, then it's all about works from there. It's all about, I've got to, show up so many times. I got to pray so many times. I got to do this. I got to do that. It's all about working. I got to work what I got, right? And yet, here's what I'm telling you, and especially for those of you that it's like, man, you've been a believer for a number of years, and you know that you've made that decision, and you know that God's calling you to live this life, to maybe get involved, to start serving, to really, live out God's call on your life, and yet you feel like there's a lacking of a want-to. You feel like there's a lacking of a passion. You feel like you're just worn out, you're exhausted, a little apathetic. I'm telling you, what you got to understand is that could it be that the reason you're struggling to take a step to the finish line is that the very key that got you to the starting line is actually the key that actually gets you to the finish line. Here's what I mean by this, and here's what you got to get, is that you'll never make it to the finish line losing sight of what got you to the starting line. In other words, grace. Not just saving grace, but sustaining grace. In fact, if I came across this was a video of 1992 Olympics, Derek Redmond. And I think it's a great picture, because like Paul, in the Bible, it says, hey, forgetting what's behind, I press on to what's ahead. It describes this relationship, this walk with Christ is oftentimes in a lot of race kind of terms. And again, this is a great picture. Well, just check it out. Why don't you watch this little video clip?
When I am down and oh my soul so weary, when troubles come and my heart burdened be, then I am still and wait here in the silence until you come and sit a while with me. You raise me up so I can stand on mountains. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas. I am strong when I am on your shoulders. Raise me up to more than I can be. You raise me up so I can stand on mountains. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas.
All right, yeah. I love that. And it's such a picture of really what God's grace is for us. So often we think of grace that it just gets us to the starting line, but could it be that the reason you're so tired, the reason you're so exhausted is because we've replaced grace for works. After we've asked Jesus to come into our life, it's like, oh, well, now I've got to do all these things and take all these steps. And yet the truth is, when we do that, we miss out on the fact that the grace of the gospel isn't just a saving grace, it's a sustaining grace. That to get to that finish line where we hear the words of the Father say, well done, good and faithful servant, it takes the same thing that got us to the starting line to get us to the finish line. It takes His grace. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of us, we miss it because we're kind of like that old cranky married couple that looks at the young married couple or the young couple that's freshly in love, and they're all over each other and they're kissing one another, and it can be really easy for us to sit there and just be like, well, one day they'll really understand what love is. That love is hard, love is work, love is pain, love is challenge, love is commitment. Love is the cross. Love is surrendering half of your life for the other half. And trust me, I believe in all that. That's true. But, I share that because I think there's a lot of us that we're kind of living Christian lives that are very much a picture like that. And could it be that the reason we lack that passion to, as Paul puts it, working out our salvation. When he talks about working out our salvation, he's not saying, you got to work what you got, and now that you came to faith through grace, now it's about works. That's not what he's saying. He's actually saying that because of that grace that God has given you, because of His love for you, and because of the depths of His love for you, out of that, you work out your salvation. You're working out that grace. You're working out that love. You're working out of his incredible mercy in your life. See, for some of you, it's why in Revelations, when the church gets kind of off track, he sits there and says, listen, you've forgotten your lost love, your first love. You've got to go back to your first love. For some of us, that's what we need. Could it be that the reason you struggle to really walk out this faith and really have that lack of a want to for doing things when it comes to God's call in your life is because it's been a long time since you've really sat there and reflected on God's want for you. It's why Paul sits there and prays. So listen, my prayer for you is that you'd understand the height, the depths, the width of his love for you, because the more we become aware of his love and his incredible grace and mercy in our lives, you can't help but want to serve him. You can't help but want to roll up your sleeves. You can't help but want to talk about him and preach about him and share about him. See, the grace we're talking about, it's not just saving grace, it's sustaining grace. May the good news never become old news to us. But here's the last thing, is that when we look at what this story shares with us about the good news, is that his promise does not disown you. His promise does not disown you. In fact, I like it, 2 Samuel 9:7, David's response to Mephibosheth. He says, don't be afraid. Surely I'll show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. He says, I will restore you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you'll always, notice that, always eat at my table. I remember I did a missions trip to Lapwai, Idaho, and led a whole group over there. And oftentimes we'd go there and do these vacation Bible schools on an Indian reservation there in Lapwai. And it was always interesting pulling into town because they always had tons of these like abandoned orphan dogs. I mean, just dogs running everywhere. So, and there were these mixed mutts and not the most attractive dogs in the world. And but I don't know what it was. In fact, I always kind of classify this as like one of my top 10 like worst pastoral decisions. Was I allowed some of the youth kids that I brought to kind of sucker me into like, hey, can we take home a couple dogs? And like a couple dogs ended up being like 7 dogs that we were taking back to Vancouver. Yeah, a lot of unhappy parents. So, but to make matters worse, I actually bought into it. I got suckered into it myself. And so Holly and I, we adopted a mutt from Lapwai, Idaho, and I came up with a really creative name for him. I called him Buddy. Because in my mind, he was going to be my buddy forever. I don't know what it was. Maybe I was hearing the Sarah McLachlan PETA commercial music in my mind, but I was just drawn to this dog. And in my mind, I kind of thought he was going to be like Lassie for me. Not that dog, no. I thought he was going to be like that. I thought he was going to be Lassie. But Buddy ended up turning like, the next picture. That was more Buddy. Buddy was like a mix of Cujo and like 2 sticks of dynamite. I mean, he was just a disaster. I mean, he would chew up things in the house, rip up the couch, pee on everything, poop on everything. Let's just say Buddy lasted for about 3 weeks until I could find somebody else who had just gotten done watching one of the PETA commercials with Sarah McLachlan singing in the background. Found some friends, found a good home for him. Don't worry, we found a good home for him. But he made it about 3 weeks with us. And I share that because, man, I'm so glad that God's not like that with us. I'm so glad he's not like that with us. I'm so glad he never gets to the point where we slip up, we mess up, we look like Buddy and walking sideways, all of our junk, and he never gets to that point where he's like, I can't take anymore. I'm done with this. See, God's faithfulness, what you got to understand, is greater than your failure. The Bible says where sin abounds, grace so much more abounds in our lives. And again, this story is a perfect picture of this. In fact, I was thinking of this and wondering about kind of the story, the climax, the conclusion of Mephibosheth being reunited, being brought back to the palace, being brought back to his home. again, a home he hadn't seen in a long time. And I was just sort of envisioning the scenario because something you got to understand, by David inviting him to the king's table was a very sacred place. It was a very significant place. It was a place where you only invited the best of the best. You only invited the most put together. You invited the Hollywood stars, the A-listers. I mean, the beautiful people of the world you invited to the king's table. And you can just imagine on that day, there would have been, David's daughters were there. And they were like the Kardashians of the day. They were, beautiful, aka they were hot in that day. They were super attractive. All the guys would have been swooning over them. And yet also David's sons were there in the room. They would have been at the table, and they were as well as super flawless. They looked the part of a king's son. I think of Abnob, who was the oldest. He was tall. He was proud. I think of Abdonijah, who was a well-respected businessman and statesman. There was Absalom. Absalom, they actually made a song about his long flowing hair. Anyone remember Fabio? He was Fabio before there was a Fabio. This was Absalom. He looked the part. And yet, it didn't just stop there. There was Solomon. Solomon, talking about the brainiac of the bunch, the wisest man to ever live. he was there. And then you got the wives of David. Again, they were exceedingly beautiful, the scriptures tell us. And then David was no slouch himself. You can just imagine back in that day, everybody wanted to be like David. They had baseball cards with David. They were trading 2 Goliaths for David. Everyone wanted to be like David.